We surrender our most critical physical spaces to the probabilistic guesses of modern code. But when artificial intelligence hallucinates in the real world, a single unverified algorithm becomes a lethal kinetic strike. The only defense against machine-speed chaos is an absolute, uncompromising stillness, paralyzing the hazard before it can breathe. Which forces us to look past the fluid illusions of software, deep into the cold reality of metal. Here, the layout remains the law, a physical constitution forged directly into the silicon of the motherboard. When an advisory network overreaches, this hardware physically severs the energy pathways to the machine's muscles, starving the runaway logic of its power and locking the system into an inescapable grip. This absolute veto begins in the quietest, most vulnerable spaces on Earth, inside elder care sanctuaries, where invasive digital surveillance is often sold as care. Human dignity is shielded by the 3 zeros protocol, replacing cameras and microphones with an anonymous grid of physics that observes only what the law permits. And before a single gear is allowed to turn, the system encounters the sacred pause. It is a deliberate, silicon-enforced silence that holds every actuator hostage until it receives the authorization of a sovereign human breath. This same unyielding logic is now ascending, leaving the Earth to govern the multidirectional chaos of the orbital void. The Nightingale 1 protocol doesn't change when the world goes weightless, it simply hardens. Under the UN orbital track, hyper-redundant robotic arms manage deep space surgical telemetry using the identical mechatronic DNA deployed at the bedside. To prevent algorithmic drift in the silence of space, every joint transition is permanently scorched into the WD117 forensic ledger, governed by the hardware-enforced orange code. In an environment where gravity can no longer provide stability, these physical laws of the motherboard are the only thing holding the architecture together, proving that the hearth and the void share the exact same structural soul. This is the Nightingale 1 protocol. A human life rests in a hospital bed, entirely dependent on the quiet hum of surrounding machines. We have given physical control to probabilistic software, where a single algorithmic hallucination can trigger a robotic movement in milliseconds. This is the reality of our digital fragility, where safety hangs on permeable code and software guardrails. But there is a radically different architecture, one where motion is physically bound. It begins with the 3 zeros protocol, replacing imaging sensors with an anonymous voxel map. Then comes the sacred pause, an unyielding delay that anchors the system in human review before any motor is allowed to turn. It is a sanctuary of absolute mechanical stillness, designed to protect life by defaulting to inaction. But this passive ward monitor is actually concealing a much larger blueprint. This is the humble tiger strategy, a harmless clinical monitor masking a silent, hardened core. The same WD117 ledger and U7 sovereign break found in the hospital ward are the foundational architecture for a massive, heavy payload capability, and that capability is now moving into the absolute black of the void. From the ward to the command module, the silicon architecture remains identical. Here, a 9-axis kinetic manipulator operates where Earth's passive gravity no longer exists. The same unyielding locks govern zero-G surgical telemetry and tactical orbital docking. The ultimate preserver of human dignity meets the unyielding force of off-world survival. Large language models and neural network-driven diagnostics are inherently probabilistic. In environments where stability is non-negotiable, software hallucinations represent a lethal vulnerability. For years, the robotics industry has attempted to corral this instability using software-level verification, hypervisors, real-time operating systems, and programmatic limits. But software boundaries can be bypassed through signal injection, buffer overflows, or remote firmware modifications. When operating a clinical robotics system managing a 150 to 200 kilogram bariatric payload, a single software overflow or unverified trajectory change can accelerate heavy motor rails to maximum speed. In this context, algorithmic drift results in immediate physical damage. A compromised administrative layer strips away every software-enforced safety limit. What is required is a strict physical boundary, an unyielding silicone cage that places the motor rails permanently out of reach from non-deterministic software. Surviving the clinical, cybersecurity, and regulatory demands of modern robotics requires abandoning software safety policies altogether. We must establish an entirely new mechatronic baseline, where inaction is the default, enforced by the physics of the hardware itself. This mechatronic reality intersects directly with a strict legal deadline. On February 6, 2027, the Global Patent Cooperation Treaty window closes, cementing the international boundaries of all prior art filed under this framework. This flowchart illustrates the strategic evolution of the master portfolio, culminating in the A13naige strategy. This 7-stage progression is designed to cleanly bifurcate lightweight software as a medical device, like observational diagnostics, from heavy, high-liability kinetic therapeutics. By structuring the intellectual property exactly like the physical hardware, the architecture creates a legal technical pincer. This structure is specifically engineered to defeat added matter rejections under Section 36 of the Singapore Patents Act, ensuring continuous legal protection from the grandparent filing dates. To understand how this intellectual property maneuver actually functions, we have to tear down the A12 hardware configurations and the A7 bridge layer to examine the physical enablement at the core of the system. This strategy enables the bifurcation of the portfolio, allowing observational software to be licensed widely, while the high-liability kinetic core remains legally sequestered under the parent priority. At the center of the architecture is the A12 sovereign appliance. This is a sealed, hardware-deterministic deliberation core that acts as the absolute gatekeeper for all system operations. For observational and non-kinetic nodes, the appliance relies on a specific mathematical configuration, P plus N, combining strict perception with a tightly constrained deliberation network. This schematic outlines the 3 zeros privacy by physics system. It relies on a 905 nanometer non-imaging LiDAR array to capture spatial data. Translation is performed via hardware comparators, converting raw geometry into an anonymized 96-cell voxel grid, explicitly ensuring 0 cameras and 0 microphones exist. That sterile geometric data is then passed to the N block, the deliberation cage. This layer is responsible for processing clinical advisory inputs, but it does so under severe physical restrictions. The N layer implements the P-register P006 orange code CPU cap. This register physically restricts computational headroom on the governance FPGA, hard-locking available compute resources at exactly 1.1x of the baseline spatial monitoring task. By mathematically starving the advisory layer of excess cycles, the system physically denies the computational resources necessary for a neural network to spin up unsanctioned operations or hallucinate new parameters. Without the required clock cycles, independent, machine-generated trajectory planning becomes a literal mechanical impossibility. Moving from observation to physical interaction requires bridging into the A13C and A13D clinical-grade architectures. These platforms manage high-torque bariatric payloads where physical movement is introduced. To maintain sovereign control over these kinetic forces, the framework introduces a final mandatory variable, the D block, standing for the deterministic safety kernel. This Venn structure diagrams the rigid governance relationship, P sub O enclosing M, P sub I, and D. The outer protocol strictly bounds the mechanical, perception, and deterministic safety subsystems. No actuator energization occurs outside this permit. Crucially, the D pillar includes the ultimate failsafe, the U7 sovereign brake. If any trajectory breach or unauthorized motion proposal is detected, this solid-state relay circuit physically severs power to the actuator rails in under 1.05 milliseconds. There are no software error handling loops to process during a fault. Absolute mechanical stillness is the immutable, hardwired fallback state for every kinetic path. The core challenge remains integration. Third-party clinical AI tools like wound healing diagnostics or cardiac telemetry must be able to provide advice without ever gaining access to those physical motor rails. In this architecture chart, the A7 translation hub sits between defense networks and clinical endpoints as the deterministic choke point, governed by a 3.0 mm IZKOS galvanic isolation air gap. It strips away probabilistic uncertainty, translating chaotic advisory intelligence into sterile, mathematically bounded kinematic center of mass vectors. Before those vectors can be released to the clinical endpoints, they must survive the sacred pause, a 25 to 1,000 millisecond hardware delay, requiring concurrent biometric, cryptographic, and physical validation through a tripartite latch. Through this translation layer, the external AI is functionally neutered. It acts purely as an isolated advisor, structurally denied the physical agency to act on its own intelligence. This physical architecture is a direct mirror of the intellectual property strategy engineered to satisfy Section 36 of the Singapore Patents Act, which heavily penalizes patents that attempt to retroactively combine unrelated features. Because the A12 core and the A7 bridge enforce total physical isolation, the legal patent families can operate with that exact same isolation, avoiding any added matter entanglements. From the foundational parent M filing in February 2026, legal priority cascades down a multi-generational tree. Grandchildren divisionals like the A13C-HC and A13D Pro platforms inherit this exact shield. By explicitly disclosing mechanical constraints in the parent core, later filings remain insulated against prior art attacks. The success of this multi-generational patent strategy is entirely dependent on the physical decoupling of the hardware. The portfolio achieves its legal invulnerability by anchoring every patent claim to the unyielding physical topology of the silicon. When the PCT window officially closes on February 6, 2027, the underlying framework transitions into active deployment. The non-kinetic observational side of the portfolio is fast-tracked and deployed as Class B software as a medical device. Operating under a dual gifting model, this public-facing diagnostic software is widely licensed. The strict galvanic isolation ensures that releasing this software carries zero risk of inheriting heavy mechatronic liabilities. Meanwhile, the heavy payload mechanical overrides, the systems capable of aerospace deployment and deep space surgical telemetry, remain quietly anchored, unfiled, and perfectly protected under the A13naige parent architecture.
This bifurcated framework allows for maximum public and clinical engagement on the software side, while maintaining an absolute proprietary monopoly on high-stakes kinetic actuation. Zooming out, the symmetry is clear. The physical isolation enforced by the mechatronic hardware directly mirrors the legal isolation enforced by the patent architecture. True safety in artificial intelligence cannot exist as a modifiable software variable. It must be an immutable physical property of the silicon substrate. This is the execution of geometric governance. By defining sovereign safety requirements purely within the physical geometry of the hardware, enforcing air gaps, hardware clocks, and hardwired power cutoffs, all manufacturing ambiguity and algorithmic drift are systematically destroyed. While others develop the upstream AI models, the MA13 architecture retains the hardware-level authority to approve or deny every physical movement requested by the system.